On a crisp autumn morning, the lecture hall of one of America's most prestigious universities hummed with an electric tension. Professor James Caldwell, a towering figure in economic history, paced the front of the room like a predator stalking prey. His navy turtleneck hugged his lean frame, the tweed jacket draped over his shoulders exuding an air of intellectual authority. His sharp, angular features, high cheekbones, a pointed nose, and piercing gray eyes twisted into a smirk as he surveyed his domain. Known for his biting wit and unrelenting disdain for what he called right-wing privilege, Caldwell had built a reputation as a liberal titan, a self-proclaimed genius who boasted of being among the nation's most gifted scientists. His students, a mix of eager devotees and wary skeptics, hung on his every word, though some shifted uncomfortably in their seats as his rhetoric grew more venomous. This morning, Caldwell seemed particularly animated, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The correlation between economic privilege and the decay of academic standards, he declared, pausing for dramatic effect, is nowhere more evident than in the admission of certain individuals whose family connections outweigh their intellectual capacity. His gaze landed pointedly on a student in the third row, Barron Trump. The young man sat with impeccable posture, his tailored blue suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of his peers. His blonde hair was neatly combed, his expression calm and composed as he scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal. If Caldwell's barb had struck a nerve, Barron gave no sign of it. Undeterred, the professor pressed on, his tone rising theatrically. Take, for instance, those who cling to anti-intellectual ideologies. God, family, patriotism, like relics of a bygone era. One might wonder how they even passed the entrance exams to sit among us. Several students darted nervous glances between their professor and Barron, whose pen continued its steady dance across the page. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the podium. In 15 years of teaching, he'd never failed to provoke a reaction from a targeted student. Yet this one, Barron Trump, son of a polarizing billionaire and a lightning rod for controversy, remained an enigma, his quiet confidence gnawing at Caldwell's composure. Barron wasn't just any student. At 22, he carried the weight of his family's legacy with a grace that belied his youth. Raised in the spotlight, he'd grown up navigating a world of scrutiny and expectation, yet he'd chosen this elite university not to coast on privilege, but to prove himself. His classmates whispered about him, some with admiration, others with disdain. But Barron kept to himself, his sharp mind hidden behind a wall of polite reserve. Caldwell, however, saw him as a symbol of everything he despised: wealth, conservatism, and an unshakable belief in values the professor dismissed as archaic. As Caldwell prowled between the rows of desks, his lecture took on a calculated precision. I've developed quite a knack over the years for identifying true intellectual potential and its absence, he said, pausing beside Barron's desk. The young man didn't flinch, his blue eyes fixed on his notes. Take critical thinking, for example. It's fascinating how some students, particularly those from certain political backgrounds, struggle with basic logical reasoning. A student near the front, a mousy girl with thick glasses, raised her hand tentatively. Professor, Shouldn't we focus on the economic theories in the syllabus? Caldwell's lips curled into a thin smile. Oh, but this is relevant, Sarah. How can we discuss economic theory when some of us still believe in trickle-down fairy tales? He wheeled back toward Barron, his voice dripping with challenge. Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you actually understand the complex economic principles we discuss here? Or do you just parrot what you've heard at Daddy's dinner table? The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. For the first time, Barron looked up, meeting Caldwell's gaze directly. His voice was steady, almost disarmingly calm. I understand them quite well, Professor. Would you like to test that understanding? Something flickered in Caldwell's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. He strode back to the podium, his mind racing. Test? Oh, I can do better than that. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. Let's talk about intelligence. Real, measurable intelligence. Did you know studies show a strong correlation between IQ and political beliefs? He straightened, a smug grin spreading across his face. I myself scored in the top percentile of every intelligence test I've ever taken. Barron tilted his head slightly, his tone measured but edged with curiosity. That's quite impressive, Professor. Though I've always wondered, if someone needs to constantly remind others of their intelligence, how intelligent are they, really? The class collectively held its breath as Caldwell's face flushed a deep crimson. Is that so? He snapped, gripping the podium's edges until his knuckles whitened. You know what I find fascinating? How someone who believes in fantasy stories about divine creation could possibly question my intellectual capabilities. All. Several students shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to Barron, who remained still, his expression serene. Let me be clear, Caldwell continued, his voice rising to a near shout. I can spot inferior intellect from a mile away, and right now, I'm looking right at it. He jabbed a finger toward Barron, his hand trembling with barely contained fury. Your kind of thinking belongs in the Dark Ages, not in my classroom. Barron's response was soft but deliberate, cutting through the professor's tirade like a whisper in a storm. You seem very focused on proving your intelligence to us, Professor. I'm curious, what exactly are you trying to prove? Caldwell froze, his mouth twitching as if the words had physically struck him. Prove, he spat, his voice cracking. I'll tell you what I'll prove. I'll prove that your presence here is an insult to academic excellence. He straightened, a dangerous smile curling his lips. In fact, why don't we settle this scientifically? Mensa offers supervised IQ tests. I propose we all take one, the entire class. Unless, of course, you're afraid of empirical evidence. Barron closed his notebook with a careful precision that only heightened the room's tension. Actually, Professor, I think that's an excellent idea. His calm smile never wavered as he leaned forward slightly. But let's make it interesting. If my score proves higher than yours, would you be willing to publicly retract your statements about conservative students being intellectually inferior? A wave of whispers swept through the classroom, one student in the back letting out a low whistle. Caldwell threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the walls. Oh, this is precious. You actually think you could outscore me? He spread his arms wide, addressing the room. Let me tell you something. I've been tested multiple times.
My IQ consistently ranks in the upper echelons of academia."
"Then you have nothing to worry about,"
Barron replied simply, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of Caldwell's bravado. The professor's smile turned predatory.
"Fine. When you score in the bottom percentile, as I predict you will, you'll transfer out of my class. I won't have my teaching wasted on someone who clearly lacks the capacity to understand it."
Barron nodded, his tone unwavering.
"And when I score higher, you'll acknowledge that intelligence isn't determined by political beliefs. Deal?" "Deal," Caldwell sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "In fact, I'll go further. If by some miracle you score higher than me, which is about as likely as finding scientific evidence for those religious fairy tales you believe in, I'll admit it to the entire faculty." Barron extended his hand, his gaze steady. "I'll take those terms."
"Shall we have Mensa administer the test to make it official?" Caldwell strode forward and shook Barron's hand with unnecessary force, his eyes blazing.
"I'll contact them today. I can't wait to expose what a farce your presence here is."
Barron's voice carried clearly across the now silent room as he released the professor's hand.
"Just remember, Professor, you're the one who made intelligence the measure of a person's worth. Let's hope that decision doesn't come back to haunt you." Word of the challenge spread across campus like wildfire, igniting debates in dorm rooms and coffee shops. In the days that followed, Caldwell strutted through his lectures with renewed vigor, weaving jabs about intellectual capacity into his economic theories. "As we'll soon demonstrate," he'd say, casting smug glances toward Barron's seat. "Some people simply aren't equipped for higher-level thinking." Yet those glances seemed to bounce off Barron, who maintained his unchanging composure, his pen moving steadily across his notes. Beneath his calm exterior, though, Barron felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about an IQ test. It was about proving that intelligence wasn't the exclusive domain of any ideology, that his family's values had merit beyond the scorn of men like Caldwell. The morning the results were due, the lecture hall buzzed with a restless energy. Caldwell arrived early, a Mensa representative in tow, a wiry man in a gray suit, his clipboard clutched like a shield. Students filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Many had taken the test themselves, eager to see where they stood in this unexpected showdown. Caldwell practically bounced on his heels as he addressed the room. "Before we begin, I'd like to share some statistics from our little experiment." And he snatched a piece of paper from his desk, his voice brimming with anticipation. "The class average was an impressive 125. However—" He paused, his eyes locking onto Barron with barely contained glee. "There was one score of only 93. A murmur rippled through the room. "But the most interesting number," he continued, pulling an envelope from his briefcase, "is the highest score. 170, which I suspect belongs to—" He trailed off as he opened his own results, his confident smile faltering slightly. "Well, 145. Not my best day, but still exceptional." Barron sat quietly, his sealed envelope resting unopened on his desk, that same knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Caldwell scanned the room, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Well, then, who's next?" His gaze lingered pointedly on Barron, who showed no inclination to volunteer.
Sarah? The professor called hopefully. Sarah, a fervent supporter of Caldwell's progressive ideals, opened her envelope with a confident flourish. Her smile faded. 110, she announced, her voice small. Caldwell cleared his throat, recovering quickly. Well, that's... Jason, you've always shown exceptional critical thinking in our discussions about systemic inequalities. Jason, a lanky boy with a penchant for debate, opened his results. 128, he said, shrugging. Caldwell's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Alexandra, your paper on deconstructing conservative economic theories was brilliant. Alexandra, a poised young woman with a sharp tongue, revealed her score. 115. A pattern was emerging, and it wasn't the one Caldwell had expected. His most ideologically aligned students, the ones he'd praised all semester for their superior intellectual capacity, were scoring below the class average. His bravado began to fray, his fingers tugging at the collar of his turtleneck. This is, interesting, he muttered, his eyes darting to the two unclaimed scores, 93 and 170. His strategy was backfiring spectacularly, and the implications gnawed at him. Straightening his jacket with an irritated gesture, he turned to face Barron directly. All right, let's cut to the chase, he announced, his voice sharp. This is really between you and me, isn't it, Mr. Trump? Let's see what we're dealing with here. The silence in the room thickened as Barron calmly picked up his envelope. That same composed smile lingered on his lips, a quiet defiance that seemed to unnerve Caldwell more than any words could. The professor's smirk widened in anticipation of what he was certain would be a crushing humiliation. Well, Caldwell prompted, barely containing his eagerness. Show us what you've got, Mr. Trump. Let's settle this once and for all. Barron picked up his envelope with a deliberate calm that seemed to amplify the room's tension, his fingers tracing the edges as if savoring the moment. The class watched, breaths held, as he slid a slender blade of his pen under the flap and opened it with surgical precision. His expression remained unchanged, those steady blue eyes scanning the page, that faint, knowing smile still tugging at his lips. The silence stretched taut, a fragile thread ready to snap. Caldwell leaned forward, his hands braced against the podium, his smirk a brittle mask of certainty. The Mensa representative shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm about to break. Finally, the representative cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness like a gavel. Mr. Trump scored 170. The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the lecture hall. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Then the silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a low hum of disbelief. Professor Caldwell's face drained of color so rapidly it was as if the life had been siphoned out of him. His sharp features slackened, his gray eyes widening in a mix of shock and denial. His hands, still gripping the podium, trembled faintly as he snatched the paper from Barron's grasp. This is impossible, he sputtered, his voice cracking as his eyes darted frantically across the page. There must be some mistake. This can't be right. A student in the back row, one of Caldwell's most ardent supporters, a wiry boy with a perpetually raised hand, broke the stunned hush. Wait, Are you saying Barron got the highest score in the class? His tone teetered between awe and betrayal. No! Caldwell whirled around, his voice pitching upward in desperation. This is clearly a fraud. It has to be. His face reddened, veins pulsing at his temples as he jabbed a finger at Barron. This is exactly what I'd expect from a Trump. Cheating, manipulation, lies. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a last-ditch lifeline for the professor's crumbling ego. Barron remained seated, his posture relaxed, his composure unshaken by the outburst. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Caldwell's eyes lit up with a sudden, frantic epiphany. Ah, of course! He slapped the desk triumphantly, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Now I remember, during the test, you were the only one who was given an additional assessment after completing the first one. He turned to the class, his voice rising with desperate certainty. Anyone else remember? The representative pulled him aside after he finished. Several students nodded, murmuring in agreement, their eyes flicking between the professor and Barron. For a fleeting moment, the room seemed to tilt in Caldwell's favor, the tension shifting palpably as doubt crept into the collective gaze. Barron parted his lips to explain, but Caldwell cut him off, his words tumbling out in a frenzied rush. Just as I thought. Special treatment. What's the matter, Trump? Can't explain why you needed an extra test? Or did Daddy arrange that too? The professor's voice carried a hint of hysteria beneath its triumph, his hands gesturing wildly as if to rally the class to his side. Barron tried again to speak, but Caldwell barreled on, too consumed by his own narrative to yield. That's when the Mensa representative stepped forward, his measured tone slicing through the chaos like a blade through silk. Professor, he interjected, raising a hand to halt the tirade. Mr. Trump's initial test results were exceptional. When I scored his first assessment on site, the preliminary results indicated he was performing beyond our standard test's upper limits. That's why I administered the advanced evaluation. It's a protocol we follow when someone maxes out our standard test, which only measures up to 160. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The second test confirmed his score, 170. Caldwell whirled around so fast he nearly stumbled, his tweed jacket flapping like a wounded bird. What do you mean, a second test? Why wasn't I given this opportunity? His voice cracked with indignation, his earlier bravado unraveling thread by thread. The representative's response was calm, almost pitying. As I explained, the advanced assessment is reserved for higher intelligences. In my 15 years with Mensa, I've only had to use it 3 times. A few students couldn't suppress their laughter, the sound bubbling up like a release valve. It hit Caldwell like a physical blow, his expression morphing from righteous fury to dawning horror. His mouth opened and closed, fish-like, but no words emerged. The class watched, transfixed, as their professor's carefully constructed facade of intellectual superiority crumbled before their eyes. The scattered laughter subsided, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Caldwell gripped the podium, his knuckles bone-white, his academic demeanor in tatters. "This doesn't change anything," he snarled, his voice low and ragged. "A test score is just a number. It doesn't negate the fact that your beliefs, your values, your whole way of thinking is fundamentally flawed." Barron's response was a quiet blade, slipping through the tension with surgical precision. You're right, Professor. A test score is just a number. Caldwell blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the agreement. What? Isn't it interesting? Barron continued, his voice measured and thoughtful, that you're now dismissing the very metric you chose to judge my worth. The same number that, moments ago, you were certain would prove your intellectual superiority. The class shifted uncomfortably, the air growing thick with unspoken questions. Caldwell's face reddened anew, his hands clenching into fists. Don't try to twist this around. You and your kind still cling to outdated beliefs. You reject science, Do we? Barron interjected softly, his tone gentle but firm. Or do we simply understand that there's more to wisdom than raw intelligence? That faith and reason aren't mutually exclusive? That the farmers, factory workers, and small business owners you look down on contribute just as much to society as any academic? Caldwell recoiled as if struck. Those people, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt, are the reason our country is. Those people, Barron cut in, his voice rising slightly but still laced with respect, are my family's employees. They're the backbone of America. Many of them might not score as high as you on an IQ test, Professor, but they work hard, raise good families, and live by their values. And I've learned more about real intelligence, about wisdom, compassion, and character from them than any test could measure. A murmur of approval rippled through the classroom, soft but undeniable. Caldwell's gaze darted around, his usual allies among the students, now looking at Barron with something akin to respect. The tide had turned, and he felt it slipping through his fingers. By the way, Professor, Barron added, his tone softening, your score of 145 is exceptional. You should be proud of it. I just wish you could be proud without needing to tear others down. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. For perhaps the first time in his storied career, the eloquent professor found himself utterly speechless. His carefully constructed worldview, the one where intellectual superiority aligned perfectly with his political beliefs, lay in ruins at his feet. Class dismissed, he finally croaked, gathering his papers with trembling hands. We'll continue this discussion next time. As students began to file out, many nodded respectfully to Barron as they passed, their eyes lingering on him with newfound curiosity. Caldwell slumped into his chair, staring blankly at the wall, his mind reeling. The day's lesson had indeed been about intelligence, just not the kind he'd intended to teach. Barron lingered behind, his movements unhurried as he gathered his things. He approached Caldwell's desk, a stack of neatly written notes in his hand. These are my notes from your previous lectures, Professor, he said, sliding them across the worn wood. I've added some perspectives from my father's business experiences and our family's interactions with workers across the country. I thought you might find them interesting. Caldwell picked up the notes, his fingers brushing the paper as if it were a foreign object. He looked up at Barron, his gray eyes clouded with a mix of exhaustion and something else, perhaps a flicker of respect. You know, Mr. Trump, he said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. In all my years of teaching, I've never had a student teach me quite as much as you have. Barron smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his reserve. "We all have something to learn from each other, Professor, even those we initially dismiss." He turned to leave, but Caldwell called after him, his tone hesitant but sincere. "Mr. Trump, thank you for showing me what true intelligence looks like." And there it was, the greatest lesson of all. In a world so quick to judge, so eager to divide, sometimes the most brilliant minds were the ones who chose understanding over arrogance, respect over ridicule, and wisdom over mere knowledge. Barron walked out into the autumn light, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a quiet triumph. Behind him, Caldwell sat alone, the notes spread before him, a man forced to confront the limits of his own certainty. The campus buzzed with the story for weeks, how the brash professor had been humbled, how the quiet young Trump had turned the tables with grace and intellect. But for Barron, it wasn't about victory. It was about proving a point his family had instilled in him since childhood, that intelligence wasn't a weapon to wield or a pedestal to stand on, but a tool to build a better world. And in that lecture hall, amid the tension and the test scores, he'd done just that, one calm word at a time.